I mean, to tie this back to, I wanted to make sure we talked a little bit about the Enlightenment and tie the American Revolution into that and its potential. You know, I've studied Enlightenment thinkers for quite a bit of my career, Enlightenment liberalism in particular. And as I look back on what I've done, most of it's been somewhat critical in one way or another, if not quite heavily critical, because I kind of come from a communitarian type perspective about liberalism. And yet what I heard in the series was a pretty strong belief that there is in the Enlightenment a potential to move in the other direction, or to move away from some of the sort of like the negative consequences of liberalism. And so I've wondered if I've kind of like tied Enlightenment and liberalism too much together.
Possibly. It depends on what's meant by liberalism.
Okay, I'm just talking about, the whole idea that the individual is kind of like the unit that decides and makes up the social contract and has certain natural rights and is kind of like an independent operator that acts on his self-interest.
So I would address it this way, because actually it's something that was foundational for Platypus early on in terms of the way that we conducted our education about Marxism and about Marx, which is the intrinsic relationship between liberalism and socialism, meaning that they're actually quite tied. And Marx was a liberal before he was a socialist, and he carried forth a lot of that liberalism into his conception of socialism. And he was actually quite critical of collectivism. So he was critical of individualism, but he was also critical of collectivism. And the way I teach this academically, but also the way I think about it and the way that we deal with it in Platypus, is that bourgeois thought, someone like Adam Smith, but others, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, they have a notion of what I would call a dialectic of the individual and the collective in society.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that the transformation from traditional civilization to bourgeois society is a transformation that liberates the potential of both the individual and the collective at the same time. Each is a precondition for the other. Actually, Marx and Engels have a wonderful phrase, not entirely original, but they made it famous because they borrow a lot of phrases from other socialists of their time, which is that the freedom of each is the precondition for the freedom of all.
Right.
It's actually the opposite of what you would think. You would think that he would say the freedom of all is the precondition of the freedom of each. In other words, that he prioritized the collective, but indeed he prioritized the individual. And that's because the individual is a real social product, meaning the individual has been liberated from traditional custom, traditional culture, caste systems, right? Workers were freed from, being artisans in a guild, from being members of mafia, craft guilds. There is the freedom of the individual and the real social production of the individual that comes with bourgeois emancipation.
Right.
And that society collectively has an interest in that, right? In other words, it's not just the individual against society, it's about society's interest in the individual freedom, right? That the individual is a product of society and an agent of society, and society has a stake in that individual freedom.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, bourgeois society has a particular notion of that, and mostly it's negative with respect to the preceding traditional civilization, to the caste system, the church, the aristocracy, the guilds, as all barriers to the liberation of social production. And so we emphasize in Platypus, and I also emphasize in my pedagogy, what Marx emphasized, which is that bourgeois society is a society of cooperation. In other words, that the basic understanding is one of cooperative social production and what facilitates that. So, Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson,
Mm-hmm.
all are created equal, with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the collective, equality, and the individual, liberty, are there, both at the same time, within the same sentence. And of course, the French Revolution, which was hastened and inspired by the American Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. So liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? These are tied. They're not opposed values. Now in capitalism, they become opposed, is the way that I see it.
Yeah.
And so what you get is individuality becomes individualism.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And collectivity becomes collectivism. And that those are both betrayals. Individualism is a betrayal of individuality. And collectivism is a betrayal of the true potential of the collectivity in society.
Could you, just for me and for the audience, kind of define what's the difference between individuality and individualism and collective and collectivism?
So again, if we look at it in terms of potential, right? So, and this is where liberalism, it's about, we want to realize the potential of individuals. We want individuals to realize their potential. We want them to achieve their individuality and pursue their individuality. But there's a way in which that individuality can be kind of reified, right? So in sociology, we have this term atomization as a kind of false individuality, right? A kind of false particularism of the individual, that the individual is sort of isolated and atomized in society, and that we understand that as a negative, a kind of negative individuality as opposed to a positive individuality. So, because it's understood that one of the reasons why we, as a society, want to realize the potential of individuals is for the contributions they can make to the collective. Right?
Makes sense.
And so we don't want everyone to be like siloed off, in their own little individualism, atomized.
Narcissism.
Right? Yeah, we don't want that, right? Nobody wants that. Nobody says that that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Ayn Rand or someone like that somehow said that that was a good thing and based it on some atrocious misreading of Nietzsche or something. Right? But it is a joke. It is a joke, right? And, I don't know. So Paul Ryan, right? Dude was Speaker of the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress with the Tea Party election.
Mm-hmm.
My age. And it's like, he's an Ayn Randist? I'm like, you're an Ayn Randist and you can be elected to Congress and become Speaker of the House?
Need to be a grown-up before you should be able to do that, right?
Right? Like, that should be a disqualification. I'm like, yeah, exactly. Because, Ayn Rand is fine for adolescents.
Mm-hmm.
For adolescent boys, I guess. Although I guess some adolescent girls can be Ayn Randists too. But it's very adolescent, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And yet somehow, right, this is where we're at. And so we have to consider how it is that capitalism makes a travesty of individuality and turns it into individualism. In other words, drives people against each other, right? Because even the way bourgeois thinkers, classical liberalism understood competition, they understood competition as a form of cooperation. It wasn't a zero-sum game, right? It wasn't like winners and losers. It wasn't like social Darwinism for them.
Uh-huh.
Right? It was that everyone would benefit from the competition of individuals, including the losers.
Yeah. I've always kind of looked at those statements and thought it was sort of like cover for...
It's not cover. They really believed it. Now,
okay.
They might have been right or they might have been wrong. Like, maybe they were wrong about that. But this is what they believed.
Okay.
And I'm interested in why they would have believed that. Right? Because in capitalism, it seems like a just so story. It seems like a nice idea. But it seems like ideology in the colloquial pejorative sense of the term.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which is that it's like hiding something or like rationalizing something bad and making it seem good. Right? But I think they really believed it. Like, truly believed it. And I'm interested in how and why they did so, and then what happens to that in capitalism.
Yeah.
Because obviously that remains plausible to people, meaning most, liberals, because in the United States we have liberals, right? We have like progressive liberals, Democrats, and we have conservative liberals, Republicans.
Right.
And that's why the conservative liberals become like strict constructionist constitutionalists, right? Who care about the First and Second Amendment and all that good stuff, which, by the way, socialists always defended that too. Very strongly. Second Amendment, really important. First Amendment's really important. Mm-hmm. Progressive liberals are kind of like, that stuff from the 1700s may not apply to modern society. Right? Individual self-defense, no, we can just leave that to the police.
Which is a pretty darn conservative thing to say.
Damn right. That's right. So we have conservative liberals and progressive liberals, and it's kind of like take your pick, right? Because they both kind of can't quite get their heads around capitalism, right? And take up different aspects of it. And I would say that, again, liberals, they don't think that like this is a society where people should just be free to have a Darwinian struggle for existence and the losers just drop dead or something, right? That kind of isn't the point.
Right.
Right. And so now that might be the reality in capitalism, but then we have to ask why that's so. And it's not just like a matter of principle or like a conception of society. That's like a real practical issue. Like, in other words, why losing your job is like a death sentence.
Right.
Why is it like a death sentence? Why can't you just get another job?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, maybe because capitalism is disadvantageous to workers finding jobs in general. And as time goes on, there's less and less need for workers. And, and of course we live a lot longer now. And so maybe it's hard to reinvent yourself as a middle-aged person and throw yourself in the job market.
And expensive, like prohibitively expensive.
Absolutely. It's expensive. It's just all sorts of things that really have to do with capitalism rather than with any principles of liberalism.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because the principles of liberalism are that you shouldn't age discriminate, for example. You shouldn't discriminate based on disability, right? Like, in other words, liberalism means we want equal opportunity, we want open door to everyone's participation in society. That's the value system that we live in. Everyone thinks that that's right. The question is, why doesn't it work?
And you're saying capitalism gets in
yes.
That. Capitalism is opposed to the other liberal values instead of being an inevitable outgrowth.
Right.
Okay.
And also, how would we realize that going forward? In other words, if we want to overcome capitalism, don't we want to overcome it to fulfill these liberal values? Don't we want an open field of social participation and opportunity and individuals realizing their potential? Isn't that what socialism would be interested in too?
Makes
right?
Sense. Yeah.
I mean, certainly historically, that's how socialists understood things, whether anarchists or Marxists or whomever, that was the goal. Mm-hmm. Capitalism was seen as an obstacle to that goal. And so, again, I thought that in my late lifetime as a young teacher, relatively in my 30s with students, who are like 18, 19, 20, 21, I thought, oh, maybe we can overcome this kind of Cold War distinction between liberalism and socialism, between individualism and collectivism. Like, you're either like Soviet-style collectivity or you're American-style individuality.
Right.
Couldn't we overcome that? Really? Especially because neither side in that really just wanted like individual versus collective or collective versus individual, right? That wasn't what either system, really, they erred in certain directions, but their ostensible values were that capitalism is of collective benefit or communism is of individual benefit, right? That's what they claimed. They did claim those things, even if they emphasized it differently.
Right.
You
So,
know,
so is capitalism a necessary stage that, I mean, this was Marx's line, right? That capitalism is a necessary stage because it does collectivize people to a certain extent. It creates a new way of working together. It develops technology and all these things. Is that basically what you're saying, is that
yeah,
it's a necessary stage, but we've kind of outgrown it and now it's
yep,
become an obstacle to furthering the liberal values?
that's right.
Okay. All right.
That's
So,
right.
um, I mean, I know I wanted to get to this, so this seems like the appropriate place. Like, how do you get from here to there, right? Because I'm willing to follow you on the argument that you're making so far. I think it's a neat way of not abandoning the good liberal values while not having to accept
Capitalism, right?
right that's obviously become harmful to individuals. So like given where we're at, not just here but around the world, what could possibly move us towards that? I mean, do you think that I mean, I'm somewhat attracted to the idea of adding a certain amount of socialism, or more socialism, I might say, back into the system, right?
I suppose that my answer to that is it's not necessarily like straight up positive answer, but that I'm very much interested in how Marxists and socialists inspired by Marxism historically in the deep history understood their politics, understood their political task.
Mm-hmm.
And, again, someone like Eugene Debs in the United States said, if Thomas Jefferson were alive, if Abraham Lincoln were alive, they'd be in the Socialist Party and not in the Republican or Democratic parties, right? And July 4th is a socialist holiday, right? Mm-hmm. And Lenin said, around the same time Eugene Debs was saying that, Lenin said, freedom is most complete in the United States. Freedom is most complete in the United States. Now, so again, what did they think? And also, what was their vision? Because both Eugene Debs and Lenin wanted the dictatorship of the proletariat in the United States. Mm-hmm. That was their political goal. And what that means has become really difficult to understand now. In other words, that it was understood in a dialectical way as both a furthering of democracy, both political and social democracy. It was meant to be the economic emancipation of the working class, which was not merely economic, but also social and cultural. It was about freeing the working class to more civil freedoms, to allow them to achieve more civil liberties than is possible under capitalism. Mm-hmm. But it was also understood as not the end goal, but as a transitional state. In other words, it was understood as something whose necessity was driven by capitalism, that the workers had to take political power under capitalism in order to then abolish political power. In other words, in order to overcome the necessity of the state. Right? So the idea is that the last state that would exist in history would be this revolutionary state that dissolves itself and then achieves the kind of civil social freedom that bourgeois society, bourgeois emancipation promised, but which capitalism violated with the kind of statism that you see in the history of capitalism, the kind of heavy statism that necessarily and not accidentally emerges in capitalism, where the state is needed to kind of constantly rescue capitalism.
Prop it up. Absolutely. Props it up. It wouldn't exist without it. Absolutely.
So again, the idea is that the workers had to take control of that. In other words, yes, the state is necessary to save society from capitalism, and the workers need to take hold of that same necessity by which the state asserts itself in capitalism, but in order to overcome that necessity. Mm-hmm. And that's a very tricky idea because, of course, in political terms, how do you, in a sense, sell people on something that's not your end goal? And that's seen as a kind of necessary evil, as a kind of tragic necessity. You know, that we would need like a political revolution and like a kind of what Engels called the most authoritarian thing imaginable, right? The dictatorship of the proletariat, in order to get past this problem that we have in capitalism.
I mean,
so
what would that look like? I mean, in the scenario that we've been talking about where, you know, the election comes along every 4 years and you have another chance. I mean, is that, does that mean that the people finally have the opportunity to elect a government that institutes a certain amount of socialism beyond?
Could be through an election. But it really would depend upon, and this is the other bugbear. So we have dictatorship of the proletariat. That sounds pretty scary.
Yeah.
A party, a socialist party.
Mm-hmm.
The party, capital P party. That's pretty scary too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because the other thing that Marxists understood, going back to Marx and Engels themselves, but certainly people like Eugene Debs and Lenin, they thought in order for the workers to take political power, they would need a different kind of organization and party than the capitalists need. In other words, the capitalists only need these very sketchy parties to assert political control, because they have things like private property, cultural and social and economic institutions, corporations. They have those things to fall back on. The workers don't have any of that. They only have their own organization. And to be able to take power away from the capitalists, they need a political organization that would look like a violation of liberal democracy. It would look like something that, because I always like to talk about this in terms of the history of American socialism. So there's a Socialist Party of America, and it was pretty strong, stronger than anything on the left since then in the United States, but not as strong as it needed to be. They would routinely get disqualified from taking office after an election. So they'd win an election and be denied taking office because they would say the Socialist Party isn't a real political party. It's a membership organization. And as a membership organization, it's invalid as a political party because it means that the socialist politician who's been elected will not represent the constituents that elected them, but will represent this membership organization, the Socialist Party, and therefore violate democracy.
No kidding. No.
Yep. And that's a very solid liberal, like in other words, they were like, you can't elect the mafia to office, right? That's what they said.
Sounds like what they said about JFK because he was a Catholic or something.
Exactly. Yeah, that he would represent the Catholic Church and not the constituents. That's right. That's exactly what they said. Oh. And there's a certain validity to that argument. In other words, from a liberal democratic perspective, that's true. A socialist party would violate the norms of liberal democracy. It would.
Because ultimately the end goal is not needing liberal democracy.
Yes.
Okay.
And also because it would represent a connection between social and political power that would seem dangerous and indeed is dangerous, right? It would be the unity of a working class social movement with political power, right? And that looks pretty dangerous. In other words, it looks like a violation of the balance of civil society and the state.
A little bit more democratic, like in the old ancient sense of the term.
That's right. So it looks more like ancient democracy. It looks regressive. It looks regressive. And that's what liberals in the 19th century and in the 20th century, you know, someone like Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, they do regard socialism as regression to ancient democracy, to a kind of ancient collectivism, as opposed to the civil social freedom and individual freedom and liberty of modern society, right? Okay. And again, it is that, right? But the question is, isn't politics and capitalism already that? Like the statism that's exhibited in capitalism, doesn't that already violate liberalism?
Yeah.
Right? And so the question is, how do the workers get the better of that? In other words, if that's a necessity anyway, if liberal democracy is violated and fudged all the time anyway, well, what about getting out of this trap?
And that might be the only way.
That's right. So it's seen as necessary, but not like an ideal. In other words, that's not like the ideal state or some kind of end goal. It's a transitional state. And the idea is that if this were to happen, then society would deliberately, politically work through the problem of capitalism and overcome like the domination of society by capital and the need to accumulate capital. And that insofar as it was able to do that, society would transcend a need for the state to manage society.
Right, right. Now here's where this is where one of the places where I always have problems is as a kind of, there's a little bit of a realist streak in me. Okay.
Sure.
And
this is utopian.
Yeah, it is. And to a certain extent, we need to think in utopian terms. Otherwise, we'll end up just kind of never going anywhere. But at the same time, I think about, what happens when people try to do these things that are far outside of the ordinary. And oftentimes what happens is another hierarchy develops and we never do get there, right? Like that's kind of what happened to the Soviet revolution, right? So like what do you say about that? Like, how could people possibly avoid that? Is there something about the conditions now that weren't in place back then, which is there's a significant difference there that might make it more likely to go right?
I will put it this way. A very traditional Trotskyist, but old Marxist answer. In other words, it's certainly something that Lenin would have said or Eugene Debs would have said, which is that it can't succeed in a single country. And it certainly can't succeed in a backward country where the state faced the necessity of like collectivizing agriculture and industrializing society. And, so Soviet Union, Communist China, both had to engage in intense capitalization projects that are inimical to the actual goal of socialism.
Yeah, right.
And that involves suppressing the workers necessarily and not accidentally. So the idea would be something like this. In the advanced capitalist countries where capital is concentrated, where you don't need to transform peasants into workers and you don't need a crash industrialization program, that again, and there's no guarantee that this will work, but the necessities would be different. In other words, the necessity would not be to catch up with capitalism, but the necessity would be to transcend capitalism because we already have it. Right. And so, and again, also at a global scale, obviously, where capital is concentrated, where industry and the general social intellect are concentrated and accumulated, obviously that's of concern to the entire world. In other words, I think that American capital belongs to the people of the world. And of course it really does. And that's why the US gives billions of dollars in foreign aid and developmental projects and technology, to developing nations. It's understood already under this system. It's understood. It's a world system.
It's built on them. It really
It's it belongs to them because the future of humanity belongs to them, and the potential future of humanity is accumulated in capital. It is and has to be realized, and so it's a strategic matter. Meaning, where does this have to happen? If it doesn't happen here in the United States, it won't happen anywhere. If it doesn't happen in places like the United States, the EU, now China, Japan, if it doesn't happen in these countries, it's not really going to happen anywhere because, you can't ask poor countries to leap from the realm of necessity.
So, it seems like we're going to go one of two directions in a way. We're either going to have some sort of popular rebellion at a certain point just because the system as it is just makes too many people's lives so insecure and unpredictable and impoverished, or we're going to move towards some sort of authoritarian capitalism, which will at least be able to hang on a little longer, and who knows what, but those seem to be the two
nightmare scenarios.
Yeah, neither one of which are going to be happy in the short run anyway, right?
No.
But I did want to make sure, and this kind of follows along with what we've been talking about anyway, but a couple of things also that that kind of like plague me when I think about this type of transition, even in the ideal sense of moving towards more of a real socialism. One having to do with kind of like the already alienating and deadening kind of mind-numbing conditions of a lot of the labor, the type of labor that has been developed in capitalism, which I assume you'd have to keep quite a bit of it to take advantage of the capital that has accumulated, and you use it for the common good.
You could spread the jobs around more. In other words, you could employ
Yeah.
more people in those jobs and therefore make each of them work less, and you could pay them more.
Okay. So they would have more variety, they would have more time,
Free time.
free time, because they wouldn't be working for other people's profits. Yep. Okay.
And also they wouldn't be, we live in a society of unemployment and overwork, meaning some people struggle to get a job at all, and those who do have jobs are forced to work too much.
Yeah.
Right? So, for instance, my partner today is at work, and he's been at work for more than 24 hours straight because it's crunch time, and because over the years they've whittled away at his department. And so they have the bare minimum number of workers. They hire a few temps, and they make them stay at the office for like 36 hours straight to get some work done a few times a year.
Good Lord.
And It's like, well, why can't you hire a few more people? Because it's too expensive. Doesn't make sense to hire more people than you need if you only need those people a few times a year. Well, why not hire more temps? Okay, but then you need more people to train the temps. Right? And so they just end up in this kind of unworkable place. And, and I'm like, how can they do this to you? And he's like, well, I could always quit my job. And I'm like, that's the only alternative?
Yeah, it's probably baked into his contract, right?
It's totally baked in, right? I mean, they pay him nice overtime and whatever, but it's just like absurd. And he always comes back from these stints where he's like, I have to find a new job. And that lasts for about a week, and then he's like, actually I have a pretty good job, except when it's really bad. Right? But you think about that, you think about all the unemployed people in Chicago, and you think, shit, the distribution of work is really irrational.
Yeah. And all the people who are working multiple jobs, none of which are secure, and they're just trying to eke out a living. And I don't know how you think about this, but a lot of them are making and doing things that don't really need to be made or done. So you'd be able to increase efficiency because you'd get rid of all of these irrationalities. You'd be able to actually think about what people need as opposed to one aspect of capitalism that I find just egregious is how much crap is sold to people that is totally worthless and that they don't get any joy out of, and it just clutters up our world and our planet, right? And all that, the need for this stuff is kind of ginned up,
Yeah, it's an artificial necessity. It's a false necessity. That's how Marx described it. That capitalism produces false necessities. Now, the interesting thing is that those false necessities are necessities. They become necessities. They become practically necessary. And they're false in a sense of not simply false, but that they, in a distorted way, suggest an actual potential that we have to realize. So we have a kind of constrained and distorted and kind of like ugly version of a social potential that is expressed in capitalism.
Yeah, because it's a huge largesse, right? We're capable of so much. And
crisis of overproduction. Capitalism, Marx understood capitalism as a crisis of overproduction. So why are people poor? They're not poor the way peasants were poor, right? Because of finite resources. People are poor now because of overproduction.
Which makes no sense. I mean, it's just...
And yet it's real.
It is ugly.
It's real, nonetheless, real, right? And so it's one of these funny things where it's like, who would have known that overproduction would result in a new kind of poverty?
Right.
And yet it has. And so capitalism is a very peculiar thing in the history of the world. Very peculiar thing.
I think it's good to remember that too, because now I think everybody, or an awful lot of people, think it's the only thing that could possibly exist, right? And it makes the most sense, and it's run on rational principles. But when you take a good look at the outcome, it seems very irrational. But at this point in time, our technology and our capabilities have really they've outrun
Outstripped. Yeah.
our our planning and our ability to think through whether they're even good for us or whether they're working for us. And yeah,
That's a political problem.
mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I emphasize so much in my own thinking politics. Right? It's not really an economic problem. It's not really a social and cultural problem. It's a political problem.
Yep.
And yet we're constantly convinced otherwise. We're constantly diverted from that into like culture wars and social divisions and apparent economic like rationalizations, really.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And all of these are ways of avoiding the political task until, of course, we can't avoid it. Meaning every time one of these elections happens, we're like, wait, oh yeah, that's right, politics. Right? And then we don't know how to think about it. We think about it as like gang warfare or cultural affinity or something.
Yep. Which is why I think, we do different things. I do something different to a certain extent than you do. But both of us are trying to educate people about systemic underlying causes that kind of try to cut through all of that chaos and manufactured hostilities, right? That so many of the divisions that we're seeing in our society don't really get to the essence of what the problem is. They're diversions. They really are.
They appear real insofar as we are actually pitted against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so this society engenders a lot of misanthropy and kind of antisocial psychology and attitudes. And, it's a very ugly society in that way. I mean, at other times, of course, we do transcend these things. We have these moments of like, solidarity and altruism and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But when the chips are down, people objectively are turned against each other. They really are. At least it looks that way, right? It looks like, it's like whites versus blacks or something, right? That for blacks to get something, whites have to give something up. It's actually not true, but it looks that way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I like the fact that the Platypus Society is trying to remind people of the better angels, I guess, in their own society, which we desperately need. Along the lines of our conversation, I'd also like to ask, so if we're in that like true socialist future, another concern is the environment. I mean, we're facing potentially a real like cataclysmic issue with global warming. Different people have different views about this, just, how much it's man-made or even whether it's as a big of a problem. But let's just say it is, because I sort of am, when I gamble on stuff that's existential threat, I tend to just say, well, okay, let's act as though it's true, because
yeah,
to not is too big of a risk. So obviously, like our historical examples of communism didn't do too well in this regard. In fact, you could argue maybe that they did worse than capitalist countries. In
certain respects, definitely. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So like, how do you see that ideally being handled by a communist or true socialist society?
I mean, I think there's reason for optimism that general social planning in the realm of production at a global scale could address climate change and broader environmental issues. Right? I think in capitalism, it's going to be very hard to do that. In other words, I don't think that an international carbon exchange or the Paris Climate Accords, I don't think it came up in the debate last night between Biden and Trump. And Trump just said, look, the US is declining in its carbon emissions. And meanwhile, China and India and Russia are pumping out carbon like no tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And, we're already cutting our emissions. Why should we make sacrifices when other countries are benefiting from dirty technology? And Biden said, because we have to assert moral leadership, and that's why we need to be in the Paris Accords. And I just think, no, it's not going to happen that way. It's not moral leadership, right? What you'd need is actual political authority over production in both the United States and China and India and Russia and everywhere else. You'd need a unified, central, global plan, a real one, not some, treaty in which the idea is to exercise moral authority, moral influence over countries that are burning fossil fuels out of need, not just out of greed, but out of need.
Right, and they're thinking, well, why should we not do this when you all went through this process? And
and so I just feel like, again, it's not really a moral issue; it's a practical issue, but it's a practical issue that needs a political solution. So I think that, whether we're in like a cycle of global warming that's like a natural cycle or a man-made, greenhouse emission dynamic or some combination of the two, obviously we have an interest in asserting some control over even something that might be a natural process.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? And so the question is how?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there are many, many, many possibilities. So I guess like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like the Green New Deal idea is that this will be like government investment in research and development that will spur innovation and create a more prosperous United States, will create new jobs. I mean, that's what Biden said. And that's plausible. And Trump's attitude is, well, meanwhile, we're competing on the global capitalist stage. And, he wants to incentivize corporations, relax regulations, allow the free market to do its thing. And I mean, probably it's going to be neither in both of those things. And some kind of, like, I think that generally speaking, US companies and production in the United States will get greener anyway.
They are.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And, that will happen. And so the question is, will it happen in time? I mean, I think that the alarmism about like, we don't have 5 more years, that's all just about Trump.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense.
Because I would say we either have more time than that or it's already too late.
Yeah, right.
And so I feel like this kind of blackmail is just silly. And, and I just feel like it's also apolitical because it really is like, okay, so you really think like Biden's going to solve it, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm like,
no.
Right? Like even if the Democrats got like 60 members in the Senate and majority on board for the Green New Deal in the House of Representatives and the presidency, guess what? It's going to still be more difficult than that, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like, it's a good idea. Let's just do it. You're still going to have to get the cooperation of corporations. And obviously it is going to be an international thing. It is going to be about how the US relates to other countries and how American corporations operate on a global stage. Because what do we want the American corporations to dump all their environmental problems on the third world, which they already do.
Yeah.
They already do that.
Mm-hmm.
They already do that. So European companies and American companies are green in Europe and the United States, and they're nasty everywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what we want? Because we do that already. Toxic waste is dumped in the third world already.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
They're our dumping ground. Mm-hmm.
And in an international division of labor and like logistical chain of production, the dirty parts are located elsewhere.
And people just don't see them. So
yeah, And I'm like, is that what we want? I don't know.
I hope not. I hope not. I mean, a lot of what, as I've been listening to you, a lot of what you said has a moral undertone. I know that you know, when it comes to Marxist theory, um, there's not so much, you
We
know.
should be scientific, not moral.
Right, right, right.
The
But
only reason for that is, like, well, first, we know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions,
yes.
right? And Hegel says we suffer most from our good intentions
Hmm.
as a society. Like the big mistakes, the big sacrifices usually result not from the worst intentions, but the best intentions. But apart from that, I don't know if it's about realism versus utopianism or sciencism versus moralism. I mean, these are the ways that people have talked about it historically on the left and around Marxism. Um, I do like other, like the history of bourgeois thought, like Kant or Hegel or, these older thinkers. I do think our highest moral obligation is to realize freedom. I do think that freedom is our highest morality. Freedom understood as realizing our potential. I do think that is the highest morality. And traditional moralities is always there to say, well, what about human hubris? What about the expulsion from the Garden of Eden due to the eating of the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge?
Hmm.
Right? Isn't this hubris of realizing our potential, isn't it more destructive? Doesn't it do more harm than good? So the religious people will always be there to say that. But I go my own way with that and say, no, we are obligated to realize the potential of our species collectively and individually and to pursue our freedom. And yes, we create problems for ourselves along the way, and that tasks us on further. I am a leftist. I'm not a right wing. I'm not skeptical about freedom.
Hmm.
But I put my stakes in that,
Hmm.
right, in that gamble.
I think that's I mean, you make me hopeful, actually, for what it's worth. And we're almost out of time. I promised that I'd keep it to 2 hours, and it's been great. But I did want to ask you one more question, which is just, what's next for the Platypus Society? Like, where do you want this organization to go next? What do you see its role in the next couple of years, and what would you like the viewers here to kind of like? What would you say to them as to like what they should be checking out in the future from the Platypus organization?
Well, I'd say, first of all, check us out online at platypus1917.org.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the COVID pandemic lockdowns and social distancing, we've moved a lot of our activities online. That includes both our reading groups and our public fora, our panel discussions.
Mm-hmm.
So you can find out information about that on platypus1917.org. And we do publish every month new issues of the Platypus Review, and that's online.
Mm-hmm.
As well as we took a break from print publication during the height of the lockdown. We're resuming print publication now, and so they'll be distributed on campus in select cities, but generally speaking online. And obviously, we, like everyone else, are in a sense holding our breath until after the election. In other words, we'll see what happens. And our project, because it really is about hosting the conversation on the left, really does depend upon the directions that the left itself goes in. In other words, that the left really does set our topics of engagement, both in terms of our publication of articles, both by Platypus members and by non-Platypus members. Mostly we publish things by non-Platypus members, actually.
Okay.
And in terms of our public events. Our reading group is a pretty stable year-to-year syllabus that's just on the fundamentals of Marxism and the background in bourgeois revolutionary thought. So we do a kind of concise history of Marxism, primary readings from the history of Marxism, but we preface it with several weeks of bourgeois thinkers, classical liberals. We read Rousseau and Adam Smith and Kant and Hegel and Benjamin Constant and Abbé Sieyès, the French revolutionary pamphleteer, What is the Third Estate? We just did last week in the reading group syllabus. So people around the world are reading this stuff. Like that's what we do in Platypus. And we have a lot of people in the reading groups who are not members. So we have participation from people who are not members, because members are like people who are taking responsibility at a practical level for the project. But we invite and include the participation of people who don't want to take that kind of responsibility.
Oh, so if people wanted to get involved in that, what would they do? Where would they go?
Well, go to Virtual Platypus online at platypus1917.org, and then you'll see a listing of the reading groups, and there'll be contact emails. There are also Facebook groups for local chapters.
Okay.
So, that's, and then because we promote our events and our activities, like the reading groups online on Facebook, primarily. We also have a Twitter presence, but in terms of like keeping track of the reading groups and the public panel discussions, Facebook is the place to go, but also just our website.
Okay.
We'll see what happens. Obviously, like not only in the United States, but in the world, like there's a lot of attention on this election and a kind of a freezing, of things until after the election.
For sure.
So we did, the series of lectures that you saw on the American Revolution and its legacy for the left. We did that, but we also did a number of panels on police brutality and Black politics and Black Lives Matter. We've been addressing a number of topics. We also did a topic. There's a series on what is capitalism. That there have been a few iterations of that, and also socialism in the 21st century. Meaning, because of the currency of the term socialism, we've had several panel discussions on just the meaning of socialism. What do people mean by it? And what does it look like today, as a political project?
Okay.
From a variety of perspectives. Again, sometimes we have members of Platypus on these panels, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have Platypus speakers, often we don't. More often we don't, in which case it's just moderated by a Platypus member. So what you're getting is an articulation and a discussion among various perspectives on the left. And we do aim at that diversity.
Yeah, and also you have the podcast, Shit Platypus Says.
We do have the podcast, Shit Platypus Says, which is a kind of digestion of our activities. It's about monthly. So it digests public panels that we've been hosting. It digests sometimes reading group topics that we've been addressing on our syllabus, articles in the Platypus Review, but also sometimes current events that we haven't quite incorporated into our activities yet.
Yeah. I subscribe to that. It's nice. Yeah.
It's good. Yeah, it's good. It's a little bit lighter.
Brings up a lot of different topics and current events. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. And I hope we can do this again sometime. There's a lot of topics that we just kind of touched on, but we can go into more depth on. And I guess we're done at this point, unless you have any last parting words.
I guess my parting words might be, this 2020 has been like the worst. We can say that it's been the worst. It's like the worst year of my life. Anyway.
Yeah.
I turned 50
right
this
up
year.
There. Yeah.
It's the worst year of my life. And let's not despair. Let's not succumb. There's going to be a world and people beyond us in the future, and they're going to need us to do good work now to help them.
Absolutely. I agree with that. Don't fold. you
Don't
know,
fold.
stand firm and try to do the right thing, and we will get through this.
We will get through this, and we have to get through this. And even if some of us don't quite make it through all of this, we gotta, while we're here, leave something worthy behind.
That's right.
Do good work.
Yep. Well, thank you very much. And I will stop recording now.